Welcome to Breakfast with the Chiefs. I'll be brief. It's the inaugural session for the season. Neil, thank you for hosting this particular event, and thank you for supporting Longwoods the way you do. We appreciate it a great deal. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Anton. And thank you to Ilsa for hosting this event at Mars. I think I saw Ilsa come in somewhere. Okay, I'm very pleased on behalf of Medtronic Canada to introduce to you this morning Omar Ishrak, and like to personally thank all of you for attending. Omar hails from Bangladesh and went on to earn a Bachelor of Science degree and a PhD in electrical engineering from King's College in London, England, University of London. He spent his first 13 years in our industry as an entrepreneur with Diasonics, Vingmed, and Philips Ultrasound. Then went on to work at GE Healthcare, where he rose to become the president and CEO. For the past 4 years, he's been with Medtronic as chairman and CEO, and he's truly transformed our company by aligning our strategy with the triple aims of healthcare. So our core strategies at Medtronic, as a result, sound amazingly like the triple aim: focus on clinical outcomes, economic value, and global access to healthcare. To enable our capabilities further, I'm sure you've heard that we've recently merged with Covidien, which was the largest medical technology merger in history. As many of you know, access to innovative technologies isn't just an issue in developing nations. In fact, it's quite an issue in Canada, we've come to know. And that's why it's very, very timely that Omar address us all today on value-based healthcare. Omar?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Looks like a very interesting session and a regular event. Great attendees. I hope I don't let you down. I'll actually speak. I've been allocated 45 minutes. I don't know if I'll really go that long or not. But what I'd really like at the end of that is to enter a dialogue with you and have a discussion with you on what's on your mind, rather than just what I have to say. I enjoy those sessions. I learn a lot from them, and really looking forward to it. But let me give you a little perspective of some of our thinking in Medtronic. And to start with, let me give you a very brief history of Medtronic. The company started in the late 1940s by our founder, Earl Bakken, who really ran a medical equipment service repair shop in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, in fact. And he went around different hospitals fixing equipment. And through that, he had interactions with different physicians. And one of them, a Dr. Lillihei, who was a cardiac surgeon, asked him one day whether it would be possible to make a pacemaker that was battery powered as opposed to one in those days that was powered from the power lines. This was now in the early 1950s, and the transistor had just been invented, and Earl Bakken, by background, was an electrical engineer, and he had engineering as a hobby. Looking at a popular electronics magazine, he took a circuit for a different kind of device and adapted it for the pacemaker. He handed it to Dr. Lillihei, who used it on a patient, and that was the invention of the first, if you like, portable pacemaker. Since then, obviously, this has become a major therapy that is a standard of care in developed countries, at least. And it always bothers me that there are so many millions of people in the world who still don't have access to something that was invented in the 1950s by our company. But that's a side point. The main point here is that the company's foundation was a relationship between an engineer and a physician trying to invent a therapy that solves a clinical problem and improves an outcome. That story over the last 50 years has been repeated over and over again by different physicians and different engineers across our company and in other companies. But primarily in Medtronic, that kind of core competence is our culture That is the defining attribute, if you like, of Medtronic. And through that, we've managed to create over time, markets of and key therapies to solve fundamental problems in healthcare, and through that had the good fortune of being able to contribute to saving people's lives and making them better. But if I go back from those beginnings, what did we really have? And what was really required in those days to create these markets? It obviously required a technology, it required physician collaboration, but it also required clinical evidence and trials. It required a system through which payment could be created from different funding sources, who would then, in the end, create a big market and make an enabling therapy available to people around the world as standard of care. But clinical evidence and trials and the deployment of such therapies was a core competence that Medtronic developed over the years. It also led us to write a mission, or Earl Bakken to write the mission of Medtronic, which has got other elements in it, but the biggest point that all our employees rally around and that Medtronic has adhered to for the last 50 years, and one that I think is one of the main reasons why we've had success over the years, is because of this mission, which essentially says that we want to use engineering to change outcomes. That's very important, because changing outcomes is a core focus of the company. Not just engineering, not just creating technologies, but making sure that the technology actually changes the life of a patient. And the words that we use are alleviate pain, restore health, and extend life, but that's nice language and inspirational, but in the end of the day, you're essentially saying that you're changing patient outcomes by using biomedical engineering. Keep that point in mind, because that is a very important point. And like I said, that mission for us is enduring. It doesn't change. The strategies to deliver that, however, does change. And back in Earl's time and in maybe 10, 15 years ago, all that was required was engineering-physician relationships, clinical evidence and trials, and the rest would happen. In today's world, things have changed. Because of the nature of such therapies, and because of their breadth and the complexity of deploying them around the world, and their expense, what is needed today are more capabilities outside of the clinical evidence generation, which is still fundamental, but that's not enough. Well, what is required? Well, the invention piece doesn't go away. The physician-engineer relationship and creating evidence, like I said, does not go away. That's the fundamental pillar, if you like, of healthcare, and our desire, humanity's desire to constantly improve outcomes is just never going to go away. And our capacity to do that, I think, also is never going to go away, because our knowledge of medicine, our knowledge of the human body is still evolving. We probably know less about it with certainty than what we know with certainty. There's still mechanisms that we need to learn about the body. This technology is being developed every day. New capabilities emerging. And you put the two together, I just have to believe that our ability to change outcomes will continue to evolve in fundamental ways. So there's the potential for life extension and improvement of quality of life will only go on, and we can never, as a healthcare company, think that that's matured. Because the road ahead of us, I'm convinced, is far greater than what we've come, than the journey that we've come on in healthcare. But beyond that, it's also true that these therapies are not universally accessible. I just mentioned the pacemaker, something that was invented in the 1950s, and today there are populations in the world who can afford the treatment from a pacemaker, which would extend somebody's life by decades. And they can afford it, and they do not get it. They do not get that treatment because of a lack of awareness, a lack of a referral system in a country, the lack of trained deployment by physicians, and so on and so forth. And that's a therapy that's been available for decades. The newer therapies that have been available for fewer decades are also not available. And so this question of access, of making healthcare more available around the world, is one that we as healthcare professionals have to deal with. It's actually more at home for us than we may think. I often cite the example which was given to me that in the city of London, so this is not, Africa or even rural India or China or anywhere like that. This is in London, England, not Canada, okay? And maybe it's probably true here too. But I was given the example that in London, you go from West London to East London, which is like 7 tube stops or subway stations. In those 7 subway stations, the average lifespan decreases by a year as you go from west to east. And this is not about money. Like in Canada, the National Health Service funds all healthcare and is proud of the fact that coverage is available. And yet, even in a system like that, where you've got a single payer, where there's a national sort of issue around coverage, even there, you have this disparity in availability of standardized healthcare. And so that's a challenge that we have to address. And in the UK, they call it I think they call it postcode lottery or something like that. I mean, depending on where you happen to live, it's almost like a lottery whether you'll get good care or not. So if that's the problem within developed countries, where you've removed the barriers of training, you've removed the barriers of infrastructure in terms of a referral chain, you remove the barriers of critical mass of primary care physicians, and you remove the barriers of affordability because the government is paying for it. Even there you have this disparity. Think of a country where you have all those barriers, where you don't have an infrastructure that's lined up with the referral chain, where you don't have in many ways awareness campaign care set up which kind of refers patients to the appropriate care settings. And on top of that, you've got literally millions, tens of millions of people where affordability is a serious problem as well. So I say this only to state that just doing innovation and just coming up with new therapies is not enough for us to fulfill our own mission, which is about improving outcomes for patients everywhere in the world, not just ones who can live in Minnesota. So that's part of our mission. The other aspect of our mission of providing this care is hampered by the fact that the cost of healthcare seems to escalate. At a very macro level, one would say that by providing better healthcare, by improving outcomes, by improving the quality of life, one should reduce the cost of healthcare rather than increase it. Agreed that extension of life will cause more people to live longer and therefore some more healthcare costs, but end-of-life care, which is the most expensive care, should go down if outcomes improve. And the quality of life should drive the economy rather than healthcare being a burden to it. And so that is what we call an optimization of cost and efficiency, which I think in developed countries such as Canada is a fundamental problem because we're, in the end, every country in its own way has constraints on how much they can spend in healthcare. Some more direct than others, but every country is a constraint. And if they don't have one today, they will have one in the future. And given that constraint, you have to optimize the delivery of care to make sure that you provide the maximum amount of coverage, and the newest therapies are made available as quickly as possible and not deterred because there's a lack of funding, which is then wasted because of a lack of efficiency. So that's the problem that I think I will spend more time on today. There are these 3 areas that are our key strategies: innovation, which is improving clinical outcomes; global access or equalizing access of care around the world; and the third is optimizing cost and efficiency. So I think that's a topic that's of great interest to us today. The others are too, but that one is a little more complicated, and I think is fundamental to the future of healthcare, and one that we collectively have to address. So let me talk about that for a few minutes. The fundamental problem in this area is the following, and why, at least in our view, there is this lack of this inefficient deployment of care within healthcare systems virtually everywhere in the world. And that is because the way in which healthcare has grown over time, over decades and centuries, is a way in which the value that is created in healthcare is disassociated from the cost that is incurred in delivering that care. Very simply put, when you provide a therapy such as a stent, a pacemaker, or anything that you may think of any sort, or care provided in any kind of setting, the cost is incurred at that very point in time. In other words, we get paid once a stent is put in. The hospital gets paid once the procedure is done by a reimbursement agency or whoever that may be. The value that cost has promised is realized well after the event. Once the patient goes home, once the patient recovers, only then has the value been generated. And along the way, the patient may or may not have to adhere to certain protocols. And if they don't, that value would have been at least compromised, if not destroyed. If the patient gets a stent and then requires follow-up medication for that therapy to have optimal impact, and they do not take their medication or do some other thing that's outside the protocol, the money that was just spent in deploying the stent was essentially, at least partially, wasted. And so this lack of accountability between cost and value, or disassociation between cost and value, which creates a lack of accountability in that no one's really responsible for the ultimate value. No one. The doctor is responsible for providing the care. They have an interest in the value, but are not accountable for it. Everyone along the chain, if the patient then has to go back to the ER for something, the ER gets paid for it. They don't care that the fact that something went wrong and the patient shouldn't have been there in the first place. So if you build this out across literally tens of thousands of therapies that exist across populations around the world, you get a complete mismatch between cost and return. And it's like, and this is the only time I'll mention business, but if you run a business and you spend without ever calculating what the return is, that business is going to go bankrupt. And that's what's happening to healthcare. And so this is not a option for us. It is a problem that we have to collectively deal with, and it may not be easy, and it isn't, because there's a lot of inertia in the existing system of fee-per-service, which is what it's called, and everyone's worried because a new center of accountability has to be created, and that doesn't exist today. And everyone's accountability levels have to change. So let me describe that now in a little more detail. What the present system does do, however, is that relationships become very singular and become value propositions are highly qualitative. And in the end, relationships between stakeholders become very transactional and not long-term, because no one really cares about the long-term. So fortunately, we're not the only ones thinking about this. I think all healthcare systems in the world, certainly in the developed world, are trying to deal with this, because I think rationally, if any healthcare economists sit down and think about it, it's a pretty obvious problem and one that has to be dealt with. And so the move towards pay for value is one that's well underway, and the fundamental point about moving to paying for value are 2 points. One is you've got to have a longer time horizon, right? Because the cost is incurred, the value happens later. So one point is that don't pay it at the point of care, pay the money at the point of outcome. And so different health systems in the world are experimenting with longer time horizon. This happens to be a US example. In many ways, I use that because the US almost has the most complicated systems with a variety of different choices and all kinds of different kind of stakeholders wanting to build their own fences. And so in many ways, the inertia is very, very present there and difficult to change. But even there, the government agencies are trying to create an environment, a reimbursement environment, where gradually the system is being pulled towards longer and longer cycles of payment, time cycles for payment. Other countries are more advanced. Actually, Netherlands, in many ways, is quite advanced in this area, and they already have several therapies where payment is made after a full year, and providers accountable for care over that entire year. The US is trying to move to that, and there are different models of care available, and I'll touch on those. But the net result of this is that the relationship between stakeholders now become more strategic and involve different types of partnerships. And for us, as a medtech company, for our part, we have to take accountability for the outcome, not just promise it. So we promise it today, and we don't make it empty, typically, although some of them are sort of, the evidence that goes around it is varied, depending on who's presenting it and the nature of that evidence. But in principle, we do try to do some level of clinical work, some more comprehensively than others, and present it as a promise. But we're not accountable for that promise, which is a huge difference. And in this mode, we'd have to at least share accountability for the outcome, as opposed to simply the procedure and say, here, you do the procedure and it'll all be fine. That's not good enough. So that's the nature of the change. So why is this important for us? I mean, I just laid this out, but let me emphasize on that a little bit. Why is Medtronic so hung up about that? And why don't we just wait for the system to evolve, and in the meantime, we'll just go along and work with whatever system that exists? The reason we don't do that, and we cannot do that, is because the very nature of our investment depends on a return that happens after the cost is incurred. So we're in the center of that value chain. Every innovation that we create has a return that's disassociated from the time at which that investment is deployed. In some situations, and certainly in some of the Covidian technologies, it's a little quicker, where you have tools there in the surgery, in a surgical procedure, where the benefit of lower blood usage or a shorter procedure time is realized as soon as the procedure is finished. But even there, you got to at least finish the procedure. You just cannot look at the cost of the tool. You got to look at what the result of using that tool is. But at least it's done within the healthcare system, within the provider system. In other situations, like the examples I've given you, where you actually put in implantables for chronic disease management, the result happens a lot later, years later. Things like, in diabetes and so on, the overall impact happens a lot later. But the point I'm making is that as we innovate, and if in the end we're going to be accountable for the outcome, we have to understand it with clarity. What is the outcome, who realizes it, and when it is realized. It sounds simple, but it's not done. And that will change according to the healthcare system that you have. And if you want to reform the entire healthcare system, you're going to start with that sort of definition. So we're in the middle of this. If you're going to do clinical trials, just assessing quality of life is not good enough, because no one's budget is formulated from quality of life years. Budgets are formulated from when actual financial returns will be. And we have to have that kind of granularity in our analysis. So this is absolutely core to our operating behavior. If we do not do this, and we continue on a journey that value is only measured qualitatively, then under severe cost constraints, a qualitative assessment is not one that will be taken seriously. And in the end, all innovation will be equalized, which means there is no differential value between innovation, which is the same as being commoditized, which we cannot let happen, because there's too much to gain in providing better healthcare and in extending lives of people. And I come back to our mission. That's central to our mission. Well, what are the other things that we can do? We find, as we talk about this subject, that people are kind of also discussing, that there appears that we just bring in a different skill set to that discussion. We're not the only ones driving this, and we cannot be the only ones driving this. But our perspective into the problem is different from a provider's perspective, because we have knowledge about technology, not just what we have, but what we can do. We have expertise to assess other technologies, which, say, a provider or a payer or some other agency probably doesn't have. Their expertise is elsewhere. We spend almost $2 billion a year on technology. Compare that to what a hospital will spend on technology. It's probably 5 orders of magnitude greater. Clearly, our expertise in that area has to be greater. And if you think of technology, our perspective in attacking this problem, together with the reverse scenario, where healthcare delivery is the core expertise of a provider, you bring these two core skills together and try to address the problem, you'll be better off than one party trying to do it by themselves. So that's what we bring from a technology perspective. What we also bring in this perspective is this very, a critical mass of clinical trial resources, which is necessary here. We won't think of clinical trials in the same way. It may be shorter term trials. We still need to do the trials, the conventional ones in many situations, but we have to use those resources to figure out shorter term outcomes. over much more sort of granular periods. And we need to do that quickly. And we have got a critical mass of resources who understand statistics, the way in which you can derive good information from data from which you can build a business model around. We've got healthcare economics expertise, which previously has been 100% applied to reimbursement methodologies. We can use the same healthcare economics expertise to understand when is a return happening, who's getting the return, how much is it, and is it statistically sound, and what are the issues around it. These are scientific disciplines that need to be allowed. This is not one that someone can do on the back of an envelope. This requires a lot of work, and we bring in core skills into this equation. And then finally, we think that because of these assets, we can be an effective partner with others as we develop some of these new models. As we think about value-based healthcare, there's another point that I'd like to make. The discussion has really been around two approaches towards it. One is a general approach, which is population health, which also talks about value-based healthcare. But there they talk about overall health of a large population. There you're really talking about a mix between healthy people and people who are well. And in that way you essentially kind of derive the potential cost per patient of a large population. I mean, that's important. But that's not our sweet spot. Our sweet spot is a feeder into population health, which is the most expensive aspects of managing a population, which is acute conditions. I think you all know that a very small percentage of the population uses a large percentage of the money. And we, together with our provider partners, can probably add the most in that very expensive scenario, which actually addresses relatively few people, but has a huge impact on cost. If that cost is released, if that inefficient usage of money is released, because of better care of these very expensive patients, first, the quality of life of those patients will improve. So it'll be good for the patients. Second, you'll save a lot of money that is otherwise being wasted. You can then reapply that money earlier in the chain to work towards population health. Because I think you'll agree that the investments in general prevention have a even longer time scale of return. Because believe it or not, most people already have the chronic disease. And you can try all the prevention you want, but these people are going to get chronic disease and eventually lead to acute conditions. And so that escalation of those conditions have to be addressed. And so our sweet spot in this equation is really working on these acute conditions in the most expensive portion of healthcare with the fewest people, and then standardizing care in those areas. And let me describe to you how we want to approach this. And again, we don't do this in isolation, we have to do this with others. But we've started to think of this in a four-step process. It starts with a very granular assessment of the disease. Because if you're going to standardize a protocol, you've got to have a very specific condition. And you've got to have a statistical base over which you can standardize, but it is not going to include everybody. And in fact, if you average too much, you will use the wrong protocols on certain people who shouldn't be in that mix, if you like. So stratifying the patients, selecting a disease that's of importance, that's probably expensive, is a starting point. The next thing you've got to do is to define a time horizon and the outcome that we expect in that time horizon. That is important because the outcome actually will change. The expected outcome will change depending on the time horizon. In other words, you do a procedure, the expected outcome on discharge is going to be different from the outcome 30 days from discharge, a year from discharge, because the patient has a recovery process that the patient goes through. But depending on how you want to structure a payment model, you need to be very specific over what time frame you want to measure the outcome and who the stakeholders are who are involved during that time frame. So defining the time horizon and being granular about the outcome is the next thing that you've got to do. And that is one of the more difficult tasks because what you need is a clear understanding of the outcome itself, which is standardized that people can expect for a risk stratified patient condition. And this has to be done, it's a lot of sort of work, but it has to be done condition by condition. And it can be done. You just need to kind of focus on it. There's enough resources in the world to do this, but it needs to be applied in this area. The third thing then that has to happen is once you've defined the outcome and the time horizon, you've got to calculate, well, what's your baseline cost? What's your baseline performance? And what's your baseline cost? So you've got certain parameters, and I'll go through some examples for you so it'll be clear. You've got certain parameters which define the outcome, and these are not activities, these are outcomes. So activities are different. Activities lead to outcomes, but the outcomes is what you've got to be accountable for. So outcomes at a certain time horizon, what is the cost that the healthcare system has incurred to deliver that outcome? So your baseline outcome, your baseline cost. Only then are you prepared to engage in a substantive discussion around what value you can create. Otherwise, you're kind of sort of hand-waving your way through this. If you really want to create a business model around this, you've got to get to this kind of specificity. So you define the outcome quantitatively, you calculate the cost, you baseline it, and then you say that, look, my value proposition is going to be for the same outcome, I'm going to reduce cost, or I'm going to improve outcome for the same cost, or I'm going to improve outcome and lower the cost. But at that point, you can quantify it. Once you've quantified it, you can then build a business model, and a business model around it in that scenario is very attractive because this is a win-win for everybody. You're untrapping costs. It's not a zero-sum game. You're untrapping cost. You're untrapping wastage. And for everybody, no matter what your baseline business model is, you'd only get better. So we have no qualms about sharing this with somebody else because it'll only be better for us and better for our partner, no matter what our baseline profitability and all that other stuff is. So we don't have to argue about who's making more money, who's making less money. We'll share the benefits. Yeah, sometimes obviously based on the contribution you're making to it, the initial investment you're making to achieve the improvement, sure. I mean, those are rational business discussions that one can have. But at the end of the day, it's important to realize that this is a win-win scenario. It's not a win-loss scenario. It's not a zero-sum game. But we've got to approach it that way. You've got to be able to quantify a value proposition that you can talk business around, that you can build a business model around. Outside of that, it's just a masked way of negotiating. That's all it is. You say you're a strategic partner and all that stuff, but all you're doing is just kind of talking about it. If you really want to change things, you've got to get it down to this kind of granularity. And you've got to repeat it disease by disease. And I'm telling you, this task collectively is easier than solving some fundamental clinical problems. It's easier than kind of finding a cure for Parkinson's or finding a cure for hypertension. Those are tougher problems. We don't know the answers. We don't know the science. We have to do discovery. This one is just organizing ourselves and thinking clearly about a problem. That's all it is. And everyone being on the same page and addressing it brick by brick and trusting each other to be valuable partners. And that's all it is. I make it sound simple, but really in the context of the things that we do every day in terms of invention, this is easy. And really that's the way in which we're going to think about it. So this process is one that we're exploring, and we're trying to work with partners and really trying to drive concrete business models. But as I said, it is tough because if changing our business model by definition means that somebody else's business model has to change. And you pull people outside their comfort zone, and you go take risks of different sorts which people aren't comfortable with, but you should be, because if you do this thing in an educated manner, the level of risk here is quite contained, and you can learn your way through that. Some examples. If you take a PCI procedure for coronary artery disease, and the point about the granularity is important, because coronary artery disease can be treated medically. Everything doesn't need to be PCI, and if it's done medically, it's a different flow. Or it could be a surgery, which is a different flow again. And I'm sure within a PCI sort of a procedure, there are different levels of patients depending on the complexity of the procedure, and the protocols may well be different. So that granularity is important if you want to standardize care. But there's enough people in the world that you can get a sound statistical base around a fairly granular set of circumstances. And in this situation, you could start in this situation, start very early and work all the way through different points in time that you can define outcomes, and depending on how you want to define your payment model, you choose those set of parameters to be your anchor point for outcomes. In this example, 30 days post-discharge is one step, or it could be a year, and it could be future. And these are sort of examples of outcomes that the parameters that would have to be measured. You can see that these parameters, the value of these parameters will change depending on whether they're measured 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road. And depending on the time horizon over which you want to create a business model and hold people accountable, those outcome parameters, the expectation would have to be different. The baselining of what these numbers are also different depending on who you're working with. And then from that, now you can then assess what the cost is of delivering that outcome. This is perhaps more complex than it may first seem because of the work that has to be done and the number of players that have to be brought into this. So one of the efforts that we made is really contain it within the Cath lab. And in Europe, for example, we have a whole series of sites where we're actually doing this. We've actually got 50 sites, which are not pilots. These are commercial sites where we've got commercial agreements, where we work together with them for a given outcome to reduce the cost of care within the Cath lab. So we can underwrite the cost per patient if we are able to, together with the provider, work on the workflow of the Cath lab. And we underwrite that cost, and we guarantee it, and we protect a given outcome. We were trying to improve the granularity of the measurement of the outcome, and over time we're working with certain of our partners who have been working with the longest history with in extending the time horizon, where the payment system exists. That's one of the bottlenecks, that the payment systems do not exist that cover a broader time horizon. So we're just saying that independent of the time horizon, the methodology of measuring outcomes and cost and building business models around it and standardizing care on a risk stratified basis is one that can be done. So this is what we're doing in Europe, and one that we want to focus on. Let me close out here by kind of, if you like, reflecting on what's changed. We talk a lot about innovation. Medtronic prides itself as a company that drives innovation, and the core technology innovation is one that we will never go away from. But today we really need to think of innovation a little more broadly. In the context that I talked about, the understanding of the economic value of any innovation that we do. By economic value, what I mean is what is the financial return at a given point in time, and who gets that financial return, and how do you realize it? That analysis is as important as the analysis that we do for clinical outcomes when we invest in certain programs. So in our company, for example, when we look at product development programs, the discussion around what the economic value is going to be in our assessment of whether we're going to fund it or not takes equal weight with what the clinical outcome is going to be. And I think that is essential for any medtech company or any company that's investing in technology. That needs to become as much a part of their DNA and standard operating process as understanding the clinical evidence is. The second, our innovation horizon is to extend beyond the time horizon of the actual deployment. We have to think of innovation of how do you look after patients after the therapy is provided. We have to look at innovation through which patient selection is done more effectively, through diagnostic tests that are connected more directly to therapy. And so the thinking of innovation from a medtech company has to broaden beyond the point of care itself. And the third aspect of innovation is that we're going to come up with new business models. And that's not a technology innovation, but it's innovation nonetheless, because you've got to figure out new ways of working together in a much more collaborative environment, and where what we do and what our partner does changes. And I think that is essential. So these are critical needs for innovation, which we are trying to drive. And I think the industry and other stakeholders all need to look at it in the same lens. So let me conclude. What are some of the things that are important? Relevant outcome measures and time frames. disease-specific best practices, not historical spending. That's the way we've got to do this. And then over time, this requires tweaking. I'm actually, I don't know if you all know, but I'll give you a US example. I'm actually really excited about a recent proposal that CMS has made in managing hips and knees as what is called in the US as a bundle payment. In other words, a payment over a longer time frame. And this was announced only a week or so ago. And although we've been experimenting with bundle payments for a while, in my view, those experiments were just too fragmented with trying to please too many people in too many different ways. The attraction of this current proposal is the following. It picks a condition, hips and knees, which in many ways is more standardized than other such conditions. But even there, the risk stratification is clear of patients who will be covered and patients who won't. The bundle has a very fixed time period of 90 days, not longer, not less, 90 days. And it's a fixed payment, which happens to be about 2% lower than the current cost of providing that care over a 90-day period for this type of patient. And that fixed payment is going to be provided or going to be given to a provider only. This is not some other intermediary. This is a provider. A hospital system gets that payment, but then they're accountable for reaching certain outcomes whose parameters have been defined at the end of 90 days. And those parameters are the number of complications, the patient outcome, the patient experience, the number of revisits. They're all clearly outlined, and they're baseline to start with. And the hospital, if they do not reach those outcomes, are in fact penalized further. If they reach those outcomes and as a result cost is reduced more, they keep the profit. So this is a pretty good start. At a value-based payment which spans 90 days, which has single point accountability, the hospital is now responsible for the 90 days, even though historically they don't have any control over what happens when the patient is discharged from the hospital. So now they'll be held responsible for that, and so if some nursing or someone kind of charges money, it's the hospital's, and for the patient that's been treated in the hospital will be penalized if that cost is too high. And so they'll have to go and either make a deal with the nursing home or buy them or do something else. And so this single point accountability is what I like so much about this. That's a system that we as a medtech company can now go to a provider and say, look, we can help you with this. Here are technologies that we can do for you to get visibility of this, or we can improve that or the other, or we can help you in your thought process. And that's something we can work with. And so I find that really exciting, that move. That's still in the comment period, and we'll obviously provide as much support as possible in that scenario. But I really think that that's a great start. And I just lay that out because it's an example that I'm familiar with. I'm sure that in other countries, similar kinds of things are going on. I'm not certain about the proposals in Canada. Perhaps many of you may have some ideas on that. But I do know that, like I said, in the Netherlands, such programs do exist. And they actually exist over a year time frame. And we're working with the government there and trying to set up and partner with the different providers in working in that environment. You know, that's really all I have. I hope I provoke some thought as to the challenges in healthcare, and I'd be delighted to enter into a Q&A session with you. So thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just a few questions for you.
Many questions, yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. Wanted to see if you had any comments as to what the role of educating the consumer would be in this paradigm shift, given that whether they're part of a third-party insurance company or in a single-payer healthcare system like we have in socialized medicine environments, they are ultimately the people that are paying for all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, you know, to the degree that the consumer is always educated about an overall outcome, and can, you know, you can't do these in isolation. If I assume that the world has already shifted to this kind of a payment scheme, then it's one thing. Then it's educating the patient about who to talk to and what the accountability periods are and what the system is. If we want to engage the consumer in the shift before this has happened and engage the consumer in being a voice in moving towards this, then it's a different kind of education where you have to open their eyes as to what the dangers are in the current incentive systems around the whole world. And for them to actually ask more questions about what happens after the care and who are responsible for it. And I think, unfortunately, in today's setup, patients just have to be more aware of what their condition is. And doctors and providers often complain that they kind of know too much, but if you aren't going to solve it another way, then you have to do that. And so patients go look up the internet and do all those kinds of things, but to the extent that this can be done in a much more controlled way, I think it helps. But it really depends on where we stand. If the system is already shifted, it's an easier task at hand where the consumer simply has to be educated in a much more effective way about what they can expect. If the system hasn't shifted, it's more complex, then they have to kind of be part of the solution themselves and learn by themselves. But I think making more people understand the very fact that there's no accountability in this, which they feel today, will create a better level of awareness and will create more of a direct move towards forcing a change of some sort. Okay. Yeah.
The model of the responsible care across the total patient experience is great. If you move beyond just a hospital being responsible to home care, community physicians, laboratories, and so on, we may have a single payer, but it's split into multiple silos that have their own responsibilities. I was going to ask, have you seen any opportunities globally where in fact that has been solved? I mean, we know Geisinger and others, but have you seen that? And would you, as a company, take on a solution of home care, hospital, GP?
Yes, we would. We would. I think in the end, the solution has to be overall accountability. Now, the number of stakeholders changes as the time horizon increases. And so that's why we start off with a certain period, but we intend to increase that over time. And we absolutely want to work. We can't do this by ourselves. We can't deliver all the care. We can't be a healthcare system. So we've got to have other stakeholders. But we've got other stakeholders who believe in the same methodology. And we want to work on an outcome at a certain time horizon and work together with others in addressing all the points of care in between. I think, look, there are single-payer systems in many countries in the world. But there is no truly value-based system. UK, and I'm sure that's the case in Canada. I like the UK because the NHS is, sort of well-known and well-publicized. NHS, in the end, is a common brand name for a fee-for-service system. It's a fee-for-service system. The hospital gets paid for their work. They don't care about what happens outside. NHS pays for it. They're called NHS. Their community centers are also called NHS, but they don't work together. They're managed separately. So it's the same as any fee-for-service system. And by the way, the US, 70% of the US actually is paid for by the government. Medicare and Medicaid comprise of over 60% of the US population, which is essentially a single-payer system. So this is not a matter of single-payer or dual-payer or even private or public. It's a matter of the thinking around, are you fee-for-service or are you value-based? And that is the challenge. I think everything else is just internal politics of some sort, and it really doesn't matter. The tough problem here is moving from fee-for-service to a value-based system. And I think that's the problem all of us collectively should kind of rally around and try to address. Okay. Yeah.
In the very beginning, there was a question asked about consumer involvement, how to educate consumer, how will it impact the outcomes. I would like to see now in healthcare, there is a big buzz of consumer engagement, consumer participation. That is in Canada as well in US as well as UK. UK was one of the leaders in that. How does Medtronic sees consumer engagements in its innovation, development of products, as well as implementation, all through that continuum, as well as being part of outcome-driven, value-driven system, which you are envisioning?
Well, You just gotta look, if a person is critically ill in a hospital, in an ICU, that consumer really doesn't have much say. Because there, you're in the ICU, you're critically ill, you're in the hands of the provider. And you've got to trust that that provider understands the clinical impact of the actions that they're taking in a way that they're accountable for the right outcome. At that point, you or me or any patient out there, when we're sitting in an ICU, I don't have time to think about my rights. Okay? All I want to do is get better. Okay? Now, flip to the other situation. I've got, pre-diabetes or something like that. I have to be informed. And I should take some level of accountability for my own health. And I should understand at that point, being made aware of what's right and what's wrong. And I should take personal accountability for my behaviors and be interested in it. And have monitors or whatever else that's available that we can make available that makes sense, that a patient can use and take action on. So depending on the state of acuity of the condition, the consumer engagement is obviously going to be different. The point is that I go back to this value-based system, and I think the point that was earlier made, that depending on the time horizon that you look at and the level of acuity, there are different stakeholders who play different roles in providing and reaching a certain outcome. The less acute the situation, the more engaged and more sort of direct involvement we need from the consumer, because they play an active role in managing themselves. The more acute the situation gets, there's not a whole lot the consumer can do. I mean, you've got to get a degree in medicine if you really want to try to impact that seriously, otherwise you'll do the wrong things. You've got to depend on trained professionals who understand healthcare to deliver care in the right way at that point. So I think that's the balance that we've got to provide, and we just got to kind of put all those things in perspective, and there's no magic answer here. Consumer accountability is one piece of it, it's not everything. It's not going to solve the most expensive cases. The most expensive cases have to be solved by healthcare systems around the world, because in those situations, it's too late for consumer action. At that point, you have to depend on healthcare systems to work in a holistic way in which the interests of the consumer or the patient are maintained at the highest level of priority. Okay?
So a great presentation. My question is going back to your key point around the value-based proposition and where, from a system perspective, is the best investment made. So the literature has been in existence for over 100 years that health promotion and focusing on the determinants of health, that early investment, whether it's in education, housing, clean water, has a bigger bang for your buck than any kind of episodic or interventional type of treatment. From a public policy perspective, it's there in patches, but it's not fundamentally defined. So how does a technology vendor get behind an investment at the very, very front end that is actually not, is just basic education and maybe not even consumer accountability, because they're not even consumers just yet. It's just a healthy lifestyle kind of philosophical position.
Look, a number of points around that. First of all, there's only so much we can do. I mean, you're right. Clean water and so on are critical to providing good downstream health. But we're not going to go into business in providing clean water. I mean, that's somebody else's problem. Maybe we can support it somewhere, but that's not our expertise. So there's only so much we can do. But the point still remains that this ecosystem is not a one solution for everything. Like I pointed out earlier, the highest cost in healthcare where the care is most inefficient is actually in the most acute states. That's where the highest cost is. And our added value is to focus effectively on those points of care where it's most expensive and make those most efficient, so cost and money can be released for inefficient use. That money then can then be redeployed towards longer term investments of the nature that you're talking about. That is the most effective thing that we can do. For us to pretend that we know about, sanitation and all of that is not something that we know anything about, and very little value we can add. We can support it. I'm not going to fight that. But the best thing that we can do is free up wasted money so someone else who has expertise in that area has the funds to invest, because their return is going to be longer term. And they will not be able to capture that return as effectively as we can. And so our biggest value in doing what we know how to do, which is take care of chronic conditions in acute settings of people who are already ill and prevent further escalation of those people, and still free up enough money that preventive care of people who don't have any illness can still be invested in. And those are the areas where consumer education is most badly required. And you will play our part there. But again, there's so much we can do, and we want to direct our money and expertise into areas that we can make a difference. Okay?
Yeah. Hey, great presentation. First of all, I'm going to say I agree with pretty much everything you said, so this is going to sound a little argumentative. It's really not. For example, say I'm a company who do a cardiac procedure, and within our time horizon, the patient has a stroke. I could argue the stroke was caused by something else, that it wasn't our fault, and therefore we should still get paid. Do you see this being a platform for new arguments in litigation?
Well, yeah, that's why you need to change business models. But I think for that reason, and again, we're kind of exploring this, and there may be some tweaking in this methodology, but that's why I made such a big point about risk stratification to start with. You cannot tell to 100% certainty as to who's going to get a stroke and who's not, but you can, through statistical evidence, say who's more likely than others. And at least you've got to take that. So up front, in figuring out how you risk stratify the patients who go into a certain defined protocol, you kind of, at least statistically, try to define people with known conditions, but by the definition of statistics, you're going to get outliers. And I think the way we've got to do this is that for a given risk stratification, you've got to be responsible for all cause issues. But because the statistics will then define the center of gravity of cost, and outliers will then be absorbed by that, because that's the nature of the statistics. Because outliers will be relatively few and you can absorb them. But you've got to do that upfront statistics very carefully, because if you do not do that, then you'll get exactly the sort of problem you talk about. And those are the barriers that we face. People, you talk about this sort of, make these proposals in isolations, and what do high care centers say? Hey, I don't want to deal with value-based care because I treat only the most difficult cases, and they're going to fix a payment that's average for everybody, and I'm going to lose money. That's going to be the complaint, which is legitimate. But instead of saying, I'm not going to deal with it, let's make a proposal as to how you risk stratify. And how do you create technologies through which you can effectively risk stratify? That's a constructive way of dealing with this, rather than saying, hey, I don't want to deal with this, this doesn't work. And that's not an option. Okay, so I think that's the way in which we want us to address this.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I do a lot of work with government, and I think everybody agrees that value is clearly where we want to go. The big issue that I see time and time again is the governments have no clue themselves on what the costs are, even though it's a single-payer system.
Yes.
One would think in theory that it would be
They know the overall cost, they don't know the general cost.
So here's the problem, and that's where I want your advice. You have an innovative company that has managed to put into effect this costing and understanding the outcomes, et cetera. You go to government, you say, here are the numbers. Government is very suspicious because it has no comparison upon which to base any idea of, should we be paying that cost, or is that too high, or could we get 5% less? So it's a chicken egg. What would you say in terms of working with governments on these issues?
I think, look, you can't be exact about this stuff. And you've got to be pragmatic and deal with what you have. So, and to some degree, you've got to limit your time horizon to what you can deal with. If you extend it too long, there's no way in which you can deal with it. So you've got to optimize the proposal you want to make. And then you've got to take things like claims data. There is data available. You just need to be clear about what the data stands for. And then you just baseline on that. Like this hips and knees example, what they're doing is they're simply taking claims data, Medicare claims data, over that time horizon, which they have. That happens to be available. Every system, if you dig a little bit, you'll find something, because there's a record of people getting care. And it may not be exact, but it acts as a surrogate. And from that, you start with an approximation. And you start with a fairly modest goal. A 2% doesn't seem like a lot, but if you take 2% and you multiply it across all hips and knees, that's a massive amount of money. So you've got your reward in terms of volume and standardization. So the actual percentage reduction need not be very high. And then if you want to make a proposal, like if we as a vendor together with the provider says, hey, I want to participate in that, I can tell you that you take a system like that and you simply look at it from a process perspective, you're going to save 5% of the cost, I guarantee it, just by looking at it. Because if no one's looked at it, there's inefficiencies there. And if you look at stuff, any process that we ever look at, you find 5%, with almost your eyes shut. So I think the plea I want to make here is, organized action as opposed to reasons why you can't do stuff. So you got to approximate, sort of use assessments, and take some action. That's what I would sort of propose to governments to approach in that way, and propose it to governments in the same way, and hold accountability. This issue of trust does have to be addressed. We'll address it, but when we go to the government and the government tells us, look, all you guys want to do is make money and all this kind of stuff, we just got to get over that. And we'll take responsibility for demonstrating that we really care about this. Okay. All right.
Okay, well, it's interesting, and it's probably the sign of times that this whole talk turned into reimbursement and health system change.
Yes.
It really shifted over there. My question is along that line as well, too. And one of your points in their presentation was talking about acute markers for reimbursement and value base.
Yeah.
So the 30-day readmission penalty in the U.S., can you tell me how that's helping your company now in actually making the value story for an acute 30-day versus a 3 to 5 year period?
I think I'll say that's having an impact because at least hospitals are worried about what happens 30 days later. And that's a real penalty, and they're engaging in a discussion around value-based healthcare, and equally importantly, they see that 30 days is a starting point and it'll go up, so there's engagement around this. I think the methods for managing 30 days, evaluating it and paying it are very complicated today. Very complicated. And like I said, it's having some kind of an impact, but I have to say, frankly, that the techniques for working around that, there's as much innovation around that as there is in actually, following it. How do I do this, that, and the other so that I'm not in that window? And I think that's what happens if you try to evolve a system. You have all these exceptions and whatnot, and you're not going to make it perfect. And so, people spend a lot of energy in getting around it, and it sometimes gets counterproductive. So this journey cannot stop at 30 days. Because what happened, and there's lots of examples where the wrong things are being done, and doctors or physicians are frustrated because they know they need something, but they need to do it after a certain time period, otherwise they'll be penalized, or some stuff like that. They need to bring the patient back to the hospital in 28 days, but that requires a revisit, so say, hey, we'll wait for another 3 days. This kind of thing we've got to stop. So I think the accountability has to be a little broader based. You've got to make the impact stronger than one's ability to kind of skate around the system. So I think that's my assessment of where the 30 days is. Should we have done it rather than not have done it? I think we should do it because nothing else, it creates a sense of awareness that this kind of thing has to be paid attention to, and there's an equal, I talked about getting around the system, but there's an equal amount of true work going on in trying to understand value-based care, extending the time horizons, and addressing some of these questions of risk stratification, of measurement windows, how do you collect the data. I think there's real good work going on in trying to get to the right place. Okay.
I think that's going to be it for now, and
Great.
I'd like to introduce Neil Fraser.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Real pleasure. Thank you all.
First, I'd like to thank Omar for inspiring us to think about value-based healthcare. Truly a remarkable talk. I'd also like to thank Longwoods for inviting Omar to address the Chiefs, and to Mars Discovery District for hosting this event. It's very interesting to be discussing healthcare policy in Canada. Omar's here for the next couple of days, but we look forward to continuing this discussion in the weeks and months to come. Thank you very much.